Deadlier than maple syrup. Toronto, the city of ambition, wealth, and power, where the right handshake can open doors, and the wrong whisper can close them forever. The Palais Royale, a grand ballroom overlooking the shores of Lake Ontario, was a place to be on a crisp autumn evening in 1949. The city's elite gathered under their glittering chandeliers, sipping champagne, trading pleasantries, making quiet deals that shape the future. And in the midst of it all, Sylvia Parker, the wife of a rising politician, dazzling, untouchable, as it would turn out, very, very dangerous. The murder that unfolded that night would be remembered not just for its brazenness, but for the trail of deception, betrayal, and corruption it would expose. A bohemian artist, a can of maple syrup, and a network of smuggling that went far beyond sweet breakfast condiments. What seemed like a crime of passion quickly revealed itself to be something much darker, a tangled web that reached into the highest echelons of power. It took two of Toronto's sharpest detectives, Mick McCathie and MacNeely, to unravel the truth. But what they found, well, let's just say some secrets are meant to stay buried. This is Deadlier than maple syrup, and this is Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's True Crime Podcast. Hello, I'm Jay Nichol of Nichol Investigations, and this is an Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's True Crime Podcast, fictional episode of Who Done It Wednesdays and a Mick and Mack mystery. Go back to the golden era of detective fiction and enjoy stories in the tradition of the greats of writing, from Agatha Christie to Raymond Chandler to John Creasy. These are short stories. I hope you enjoy. Hello, I'm Jay Nichol of Nichol Investigations, and this is Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's True Crime Podcast. Ontario Cold Cases is a gripping true crime podcast that shines a light on unsolved murders, disappearances, and forgotten crimes from across the province and the world. With meticulous research, compelling storytelling, and a commitment to historical accuracy, we bring you the real stories of victims, investigators, and suspects, stories that demand to be heard. Each week, we take you deep into the world of true crime with a packed schedule of episodes. Tuesdays, historical true crime cases, exploring infamous and obscure crimes from history. Wednesdays, the Mick and Mack mysteries, a thrilling fictional detective series set in 1950s Toronto. Thursdays, World Cold Case Thursday, investigating unsolved cases from around the globe. Sundays, Ontario Cold Cases, the latest episode uncovering an unsolved mystery from Ontario. From high-profile crimes that shock the nation to little-known cases waiting for justice, we uncover the truth, one case at a time. Join us as we explore the dark corners of history and mystery, where every clue could lead to answers and every case deserves a second look. Subscribe now wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts and never miss an episode of Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's True Crime Podcast. Act 1. The chandeliers of the Palais Royale sparkle like diamonds, casting a golden glow over the crowd of Toronto's elite. Jazz hums softly in the background, mingling with the clink of champagne glasses and the low hum of polite conversation. Politician Henry Parker, a man with a spotless public image and an ambition that stretched all the way to Ottawa, shaking hands with donors and flashing his practiced smile. By his side stood Sylvia Parker, his wife, and the real star of the evening. Draped in pearls and a gown that shimmered with her every step, Sylvia held court with effortless charm. Her laugh rang out like a bell, drawing every eye in the room. But behind that dazzling smile, there was an edge, a hint of mischief that kept her the subject of endless whispers. "Darling, you're positively glowing tonight," Henry said, his smile as polished as his cufflinks. "Thank you, dear," Sylvia replied, her tone sweet but distant. Her gaze drifted past him, scanning the room till it landed on a tall, wiry man in a crumpled suit standing by the bar. She downed the rest of her champagne and handed Henry her empty glass. "If you'll excuse me, I think I see someone I simply must say hello to." Henry's jaw tightened, but he said nothing as Sylvia swept away, her gown trailing behind her like a comet's tail. Mick McCathie adjusted his brown fedora and nudged his partner, MacNeely, who was already eyeing the hors d'oeuvres. "Keep your eyes sharp," Mick muttered. "We're here to keep things quiet, not snack our way through the investigation." "I'm multitasking," Mac replied, popping a bacon-wrapped scallop into his mouth. "Besides, nothing's happened yet." "Give it time," Mick said, scanning the crowd. "With a setup like this, trouble's bound to show up sooner or later." Trouble arrived 5 minutes later in the form of a scream. The music screeched to a halt as all heads turned toward the source of the commotion. A waiter burst through the kitchen doors, his white jacket smeared with what looked like blood. "Help!" the waiter shouted. "There's been a murder." The scene backstage was a study in chaos. Staff members were clustered near the body, whispering and exchanging nervous glances. The victim lay sprawled on the floor, a dark stain spreading across the front of his shirt. Beside him was an overturned can of maple syrup, sticky liquid pooling around his head like a gruesome halo. "Well, that's a first," Max said, crouching beside the body. "Death by syrup." "It's not the syrup that killed him," Mick said, pointing to the stab wound just below the ribs. "But it does make things more interesting." As Mick examined the scene, Max stood and surveyed the gathered staff. His eyes landed on a nervous-looking man in a crumpled suit, hovering near the edge of the group. It was the same man Sylvia had been talking to earlier. "You there," Mac called. "What's your name?" The man flinched. He said, "Jerry, I'm a stagehand. Sylvia Parker commissioned Martin to paint her portrait. I did some work for him on the side." "What were you doing back here?" Mick asked, his tone sharp. I was, Before Jerry could finish, Sylvia herself appeared, sweeping into the room like a storm. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her eyes flicked between Mick and the body on the floor. "Is that... Oh no, poor Jerry." "Jerry's not the one who's dead," Max said. "But he does have some explaining to do." "Jerry is harmless," Sylvia said, her tone icy. "If you're looking for someone to question, perhaps you should start with my husband. He's the one who benefits most from a little scandal disappearing." Mick's eyebrows rose. "Interesting theory, Mrs. Parker. Right now, everyone's a suspect, including you." Sylvia's laugh was light. There was no mistaking the edge beneath it. "Well, detectives, I do love a good mystery. Let's see if you're clever enough to solve this one." As Sylvia turned and sashayed out of the room, Mick and Mack exchanged a glance. "I've got a feeling," Mack said, "that this case is going to be sticky in more ways than one." "Start with Martin," Mick said, turning back to the trembling artist. "Got a few questions about that portrait." Act 2. The morning after the chaos of the Palais Royale, Mick and Mack were back at Division 14, sifting through notes and nursing cups of lukewarm coffee. The murder of the bohemian artist turned victim turned the city's rumor mill into a frenzy. Everyone wanted to know who killed the man, and why there'd be maple syrup all over the crime scene. "Think the syrup's a red herring?" Mac asked, dunking a donut into his coffee. "I think it's a message," Mick replied. "Something about it feels too deliberate. Nobody just spills maple syrup next to a murder victim without meaning something by it." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a constable, who handed Mick a note. "From the scene officers at the artist's studio," the constable said. "Thought you might want to see this." The note detailed a hidden ledger found in Martin Lowe's studio. It contained a list of names, payments, what appeared to be coded messages. Mick tapped the paper thoughtfully. "Looks like Martin wasn't just painting portraits. She's keeping some very interesting company. The studio was exactly what Mick had imagined. Cluttered with half-finished canvases, paint-splattered floors, and the faint smell of turpentine. What he hadn't expected was a police photographer snapping pictures of a canvas popped in the corner. The portrait featured Sylvia Parker striking an exaggerated pose with a sly smile that practically dared you to trust her. Not exactly subtle, is it? Mac said, pointing to the painting. Makes her look like she's got something to hide. She's got plenty to hide, Mick said, flipping through the ledger they brought from the station. The question is, how much of it ties back to this murder? As they searched the studio, they found more than they bargained for. A stack of envelopes addressed to Martin Lowe, but signed with a pseudonym, J. Maple. You think our artist was getting blackmailed? Mac asked, holding up one of the envelopes. Could be, Mick replied, examining the contents. Or he was in deeper trouble and he realized. J. Maple might have been paying him to keep quiet about something. Before they could dig further, a loud crash echoed through the studio. Mick and Mack turned to see Jerry the stagehand, wide-eyed and panicked, standing in the doorway. I didn't mean to startle you, Jerry blurted, raising his hands. I just needed to get some of Martin's stuff. Jerry, Mick said, crossing his arms. What exactly were you hoping to find? Jerry stammered, his eyes darted into the envelopes in Mick's hands. Nothing, I swear. Okay. Maybe I owe Martin a favor or two. But I'm not involved in any of this murder business. We'll be the judge of that, Mac said, gesturing for Jerry to sit. Start talking. Jerry's tips led Mick and Mack to a warehouse on the outskirts of Toronto, where the syrup smuggling ring was allegedly operating. The building was unassuming, but the sweet smell of syrup inside was unmistakable. Barrels lined the walls, some labeled as Grade A Maple, and others with no markings at all. I feel like we just stepped into a pancake ad, Mac said, running a hand along one of the barrels. Except these pancakes comes with a side of criminal enterprise, Mick replied. Look here. Pried open a barrel to reveal bundles of cash hidden beneath the sticky syrup. Well, that's not exactly Aunt Jemima's recipe, Mac quipped. Sound of voices interrupted their investigation. Mick motioned for Mac to stay quiet as he crept toward the source. He found two men in heated discussion, their tones low but urgent. We've got to move the shipment, one of them said. The cops are already sniffing around. Not until we get the signal from J. Maple, the other replied. We're not risking this operation because you're getting jumpy. Mick and Mac exchanged a look. Looks like we found our operation, Mick whispered. The detectives were about to make their move when one of the men spotted them. Hey, he shouted, reaching for a nearby crowbar. What followed was a chaotic brawl that ended with both suspects being subdued and covered in sticky syrup. Mac wiped his hands in his coat, grimacing. Think they make a laundry detergent for this? Focus, Mick said, flipping one of the men's wallets open. Inside was a card with a maple leaf embossed on it and the initials, J.M. Looks like we're getting closer, Mick said, pocketing the card. Something tells me Sylvia Parker's still the key to all this. Back at the station, Mick and Mack reviewed the evidence they gathered, the ledger, the envelopes, and the information from the warehouse. All roads seemed to lead back to J. Maple and their connection to the Parkers. You know what I think, Mac said, leaning back in his chair? Sylvia's playing a bigger game than we realized. She's not just involved, she's pulling the strings. It's time we paid her another visit, Mick said, grabbing his coat. This time, let's see how she dances when we put the heat on. The case was heating up, and Mick and Mack were about to step into a web of deceit that went deeper than they ever imagined. Act 3. The Parker residence in Rosedale was every bit as grand as Mick expected, but there was an air of tension in the gilded halls. Sylvia Parker greeted them in the sitting room, lounging in a velvet armchair with a martini in hand. Her sly smile returned as the detectives entered. "Gentlemen," she purred, "to what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Mick didn't waste time. "We know about J. Maple," he said, watching her closely for a reaction. Sylvia's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "J. Maple? That sounds like a character out of a cheap novel." "Funny," Mac said, crossing his arms. "Because whoever they are, they've been paying Martin Lowe a lot of money. And it all seems to circle back to you and your husband." Sylvia took a slow sip of her martini, her expression unreadable. Martin was a talented artist, but he had a flair for drama. If he was tangled up in something unsavory, it had nothing to do with me. "We also found barrels of cash, hidden in maple syrup," Mick added. "Care to explain that?" Sylvia's laugh was sharp and brittle. "Cash and syrup? My, you two are living in a different world entirely." Before Mick could press her further, the door burst open, and Henry Parker strode in, his face red with anger. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "My wife is not some common criminal to be interrogated in her own home." "No, but she's tied to a murder investigation," Mick replied calmly. "Until we know more, everyone's a suspect, including you, Mr. Parker." Henry's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Sylvia's smile returned, and she leaned back in her chair, clearly enjoying her husband's discomfort. Back at Division 14, Mick and Mack combed through the evidence, piecing together the tangled web surrounding the Parkers. Every lead seemed to bring them closer to J. Maple, but the identity of the mysterious figure remained elusive. That changed when Jerry the stagehand reappeared, looking even more nervous than before. "I remembered something," Jerry said, shifting from foot to foot. "Martin mentioned J. Maple once. Said they were someone high up. Someone untouchable." "High up in what?" Mac asked. Jerry hesitated. "Politics," he said finally. "Or maybe business. All I know is Martin was scared of them. Real scared." Mick and Mack returned to the warehouse, this time with a warrant. The barrels of syrup had been replaced, but the operation was far from dormant. Hidden in the back office, they found a safe containing documents that connected the smuggling operation to Henry Parker's campaign. Well, Mac said, holding up a ledger with Parker's name on it. "Looks like Mr. Clean isn't so clean after all." "Here's the kicker," Mick said, pulling out a photograph. It showed Henry Parker shaking hands with a shadowy figure whose face was partially obscured. The back of the photo was signed J. Maple. The revelation brought Mick and Mack back to the Parkers' home, where they confronted Henry in his study. Sylvia watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable. "You got two options," Mick said, tossing the photo on Henry's desk. "You can tell us the truth about J. Maple, or we can let the press have this." Henry's face drained of color. "You don't understand," he said. "J. Maple isn't a person. It's an alias for a group. They fund campaigns, but they expect favors in return. I didn't have a choice." "And Martin Lowe?" Mac asked. "Was killing him one of those favors?" Henry looked genuinely horrified. "I didn't kill him. He was supposed to disappear quietly, but someone's got to him before he could leave town." "Who?" Mick demanded. Before Henry could answer, Sylvia stepped forward, her heels clicking on the polished floor. "That would be me," she said, her voice calm and cold. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. "Martin was a liability," Sylvia continued. "He was going to expose everything, and I couldn't let that happen. Henry may be spineless, but I'm not." Henry stared at her in shock. "Sylvia, what have you done?" "What you couldn't," she replied, turned to Mick and Mack. "So now what, detectives? Do you arrest me and let J. Maple's little empire continue? Or do we make a deal?" Mick glanced at Mack, who looked as stunned as he felt. "Let's start with you coming down to the station," Mick said finally. "We'll figure out the rest from there." Sylvia smiled faintly. Fair enough, she said, holding out her wrists for the cuffs. But trust me, this isn't over. As they led Sylvia out of the house, Mick couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. The case might be wrapping up, but the ripples of J. Maple's influence were far from contained. For now, though, they had their killer. You ever feel like we're just scratching the surface, Mac asked as he watched Sylvia climb into the squad car. Every day, Mick replied, lighting a cigarette. That's the job, isn't it? Act 4. The interrogation room in Division 14 was colder than usual, but Sylvia Parker seemed unfazed. She sat with her hands clasped, her expression as poised and unbothered as if she were attending another one of her glamorous galas. Mick and Mack watched her from the other side of the glass. She's not just as cool as a cucumber, Mack said. She's the whole fridge. Let's see if we can turn up the heat, Mick replied. They entered the room, and Sylvia looked up, a faint smile playing on her lips. Detective, she said. To what do I owe the pleasure this time? Cut the charm act, Mick said, dropping the incriminating photo of Henry Parker and J. Maple onto the table. We know about the operation. We were deeper in it than we thought. Sylvia's eyes flicked to the photo, but her demeanor didn't change. So you know about J. Maple. Congratulations. If you think taking me down will end this, you're mistaken. Why don't you enlighten us? Mac asked, leaning against the wall. Sylvia sighed, folding her hands. J. Maple isn't a person. It's a network. Politicians, businessmen, even law enforcement. They fund campaigns, smuggle goods, launder money. It's all connected. Henry couldn't say no, and frankly, neither could I. You could have walked away, Mick said. Sylvia's laugh was sharp. Done what? Host bake sales? The moment you're in for life. Martin Lowe thought he could get out, and look what that got him. Mick's jaw tightened. You killed him because he was going to expose the operation? Sylvia tilted her head. You make it sound so crude. I simply ensured that his impulsiveness wouldn't jeopardize everything. And let's be honest, detectives, if I hadn't, someone else would have. Max stepped forward, his voice rising. And what about the warehouse, the smuggling, the barrels of cash? Well, those were Henry's pet projects, Sylvia said, waving a hand dismissively. He wanted to play kingpin, but he's not built for it. The real power lies elsewhere. Who, Mick demanded? Who's running J. Maple? Sylvia's smile widened. That, gentlemen, is a question I'll leave you to answer, assuming you live long enough. 2 days later, Mick and Mack found themselves back at the Palais Royale, this time for a hastily organized charity gala. It was Henry Parker's attempt to salvage his reputation, though the cracks in his polished image were starting to show. The guest list was thinner, the press less enthusiastic. You really think this is where J. Maple will make their move? Mac asked, adjusting his tie. Sylvia's right about one thing, Mick said. This isn't just about her or Henry. The network's too big to ignore. If they think we're closing in, they'll try to send a message. Sure enough, as night wore on, Mick's instincts proved correct. Amid the crowded tuxedos and evening gowns, a man approached Henry Parker with a whispered warning. Henry's face went pale and he hurried toward the exit. There he goes, Max said. Want to bet he's meeting someone? Don't need to bet, Mick replied, already moving. Henry's destination was a private room on the top floor of the Palais Royale. Mick and Mack followed, their footsteps muffled on the plush carpet. Inside they found Henry in a heated argument with two men dressed in sharp suits. You told me this was under control, Henry hissed. It was, one of the men replied, till your wife decided to play hero. Now we have cops sniffing around. You're a liability, Parker. That's enough, Mick said, stepping in the room with his revolver drawn. Hands where we can see them. The man froze, but Henry looked almost relieved. Detectives, you don't understand. They were going to... Save it, Max said, covering the other men. You got plenty of time to explain downtown. One of the men made a break for it, but Mick was faster. He tackled him to the ground, pinning him with a knee. The man's wallet fell from his pocket, revealing an ID card with a now familiar maple leaf insignia. Looks like we found another branch of the tree, Mick said, flipping the card in his hand. Sylvia Parker was sentenced to life in prison for her role in Martin Lowe's murder, though she maintained her composure throughout the trial. Henry Parker, meanwhile, cut a deal, exposing several key players in the J Maple network in exchange for a reduced sentence. The network itself proved harder to dismantle. For every lead Mick and Mack followed, another seemed to appear. But they weren't giving up, not while there were still pieces of the puzzle left to uncover. On a quiet evening back at Division 14, Mack leaned back in his chair and sighed. You think we'll ever get to the root of this? Mick lit a cigarette, the glow illuminating his thoughtful expression. Maybe not. We'll make sure they know we're watching. As the smoke curled upward, the phone on Mick's desk rang. Another case, another lead. The hunt for justice never stopped in Toronto. And neither did Mick and Mack. Thank you for listening. This has been J. Nickel Investigations, and a Mick and Mack mystery. If you enjoy these fictional episodes of Toronto's finest, tune in every Wednesday for a new episode. Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's true crime podcast, is available wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Subscribe to Ontario Cold Cases today so you never miss an episode. Please share your thoughts and questions in the comments. Good night.